Okay, we're back for part two of our conversation with Professor Kristin Goss of Duke University, who studies, well, a lot of things, but among them are the role of wealth, including through foundations, in influencing government and public policy. She's a professor of political science, public policy and political science at Duke. Our eye was caught by Professor Goss's piece from 2000, I guess, 16, July 2016, for the American Political Science Association. I've got a prop. It's printed out, entitled "Policy Plutocrats: How America's Wealthy Seek to Influence Governance." That would have been written then before Trump was elected. Whether that's relevant or not, and I think it might be, we might get to that. But let me just, fully realizing the unfairness of asking it this way, I'm asking you to summarize what might be years worth of work in your career. But how do America's wealthy seek to influence governance, including philanthropically?
Yeah. So it's a big, huge question. And, as I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of foundations, large and small, that are contributing to public policy in some way, as well as wealthy individuals who are working through LLCs and donor advised funds and other kind of less transparent mechanisms, or just as private citizens. So, it's definitely really hard to get a handle on everything that's going on. I mean, you could spend 100 years doing that research and still not reach a bottom line. So the article you mentioned was my attempt to get a handle on, one piece of that puzzle, which was a group of people that I called sort of the leading philanthropists. And I wanted to know how much of their work was, centered on public policy, which I defined fairly broadly to include things like, promoting public agendas, redefining issues, advocacy, things like that. So doing kind of policy-oriented research, et cetera. So what I did is I took various public lists over a short period of, I think it was like 3 years, and compiled a list of the leading philanthropists in America from these various lists. And I had a data set of about 200 people. And then I kind of looked in every public source I could to see if they were doing something around public policy. So I looked at personal statements, interviews in the press, foundation websites, Forms 990, et cetera. And to my surprise, more than half of them were involved in public policy in some way. So this was close to 100 of these individuals. And so so that actually surprised me. That was, there was a lot of people that have a lot of wealth. So the question is, how are they doing this? Well, they're doing it the same way the rest of us are. They just have more resources and more access and more leverage. So they are lobbying within the extent of the law. They're giving money, obviously. They're making phone calls. They're seeding new organizations. They're sustaining existing organizations. They're using kind of their public voice on social media or through the traditional media. So they're using the same techniques we do, but they just, they're probably going to, somebody's going to pick up their phone call in the way they may not, yours or mine. But so I think the question is, to what effect? And it's really just hard to measure impact. And there's probably a whole lot of this activity that I just couldn't see. So that article you have has a lot of caveats about, the part that we can't see, that the dark money stuff and whatnot. So I hope that answers your question, or somewhat answers your question.
So some would, and some are actively and harshly lamenting the fact that rich people who either give money directly out of their own pocket or through foundations get their calls answered. And right. I, poor Mike Hartmann, don't, for instance, just to pick an example.
Right.
Are they right to lament that? Is it bad? Is this bad that this money is sloshing around from these people, or is there some benefit to?
Well, that's a $64,000 question. And I will say that within the, body of small number of us who are studying philanthropy on the academic side, I think the answer to, is this a bad thing? The answers kind of range from it's mostly bad to truly awful. So I don't think there's a lot of sympathy for big philanthropy, certainly as it with respect to kind of trying to influence public debates and public policy. I'm not talking about giving $100 million for scholarships or something like that, but the more political or policy oriented, I think there's a consensus that this is really not healthy. So, we really might want to think about whether, and Rob Reich has said this very well, whether we want, and David Callahan and others have said this very well, do we want, sort of wealthy institutions, wealthy individuals, relatively non-transparent, relatively non-accountable, just sort of duking it out and trying to influence policy agendas while the other 330 million of us sit on the sidelines and watch, or maybe don't even know there's a battle going on. And, I'm very sympathetic to that argument. I'm one of those people who thinks that we've got, way too much inequality in society, and that income inequality translates increasingly to political inequality, and philanthropy, big philanthropy, is implicated in this. So it's a very, to me, it's not a very controversial critique. I think the question is, well, what's the alternative? And, so I don't foresee, confiscating wealth from foundations or from wealthy people. I don't foresee tax rates that are going to, in any way, I don't see the political will to raise taxes in such a way that, the accumulations of fortunes are going to end anytime soon. So then the question is, what do we do? I mean, given the practical realities, I'm a pragmatist above all, I'm a political scientist. And, so and I want to remind everybody that most of the critique of philanthropy, again, is not directed at everyday donors or even extremely rich people who are funding hospital wings or art museums. It's really about the stuff that involves questions of public policy and public life. So on the other hand, here's the case I would make for why it's actually not all bad. We know that one of philanthropy's kind of sources of legitimacy, or one of philanthropy's purposes, is to help compensate for failures in other realms of life. So failures of the market to produce the optimal outcomes, failures of democratic governance to, adequately represent, voices, or to produce policies that people want. And you can look historically, and foundations have, big philanthropy has played a really important role in taking care of some of these needs that are just fall through the cracks of the rest of society and of other institutions. So, to state a really obvious case, the civil rights movement, was people powered. It was based in Black churches and Black colleges, and a lot of people, risking their lives, putting their lives on the line for equality. But those folks had what we in political science call patrons. So wealthy philanthropists were behind the scenes there. Scholars will argue about, their strategies and whatnot. There's a legitimate argument there, but there's no question that, social movements for inclusion need money. They need people, but they also need money. And so I think there's a role for philanthropy to play in helping underrepresented voices are difficult to organize communities, even the broad public interest, in helping those groups come together so that you have a voice that can serve as a counterweight to more powerful voices that have an easier time organizing and that have more money to devote to politics. So, I think that's healthy democracy.
Is it fair for one to conclude, perhaps a conservative to conclude, that most of policy-oriented big philanthropy in America recently, maybe I'll say now, is progressive?
Yeah, and it's not even just now. So if you look at I took a look at the top 25 funders of public policy, again, narrowly construed. And, I think you can easily say that the majority of those funders are what I would call either kind of centrist pragmatic funders or center left or progressive. There are a handful of conservative, but I think that's right. I think, big philanthropy tilts left if you're looking at foundations. In my study of the donors, so these were the big policy-oriented billionaires who are giving their individual wealth, they were really much more ideologically diverse than you would think. So I actually looked at their political contributions, and this group of 100 were split about evenly in thirds. So it was a third were giving mostly to Democrats, a third were giving mostly to Republicans, a third were giving to a mix or to no one. So, in that sense, that didn't look to me like they were terribly skewed one way or the other, terribly unrepresentative in terms of the distribution of ideology compared to kind of the rest of America. But what's interesting about so you look at, well, what are they giving to, and what can we tell from their philanthropy about whether they're progressive or conservative or whatnot. So what I found is, there's exceptions here, so I'm generalizing, but in that group, to the extent they were giving to social causes, they were more on the progressive side. So they tended to be, again, there are exceptions, but they tended to be, pro-choice on abortion, in favor of stricter gun laws, pro-LGBTQ rights, concerned about climate change, wanting greater access to healthcare, wanting immigration reform. So they were socially liberal. But they also, and this was really important because this was a big chunk of the money, I would say really they were marketeers. They believed in market principles and market logics. And those were applied to things like public school reform, where they're trying to inject new ideas. They're trying to break teachers unions and bureaucracies, and force sort of innovation and competition and metrics and other sorts of market logics in the public school system. A handful of them were looking at entitlement reform. So I don't think of that as a liberal cause. So as I'm thinking about it, this group, and this is again just the big philanthropists that are giving for policy causes, they sound a lot like my Duke students. So they're social liberals and fiscal conservatives. Yeah. And by the way, this finding about public policy donors is not unique. There was a study that you are probably familiar with from 2005 that Andrew Rich did, in which he showed that public policy donors were, in the main, were big foundations staffed by progressive individuals, giving to, centrist or left of center causes. But that the conservative funders, who were vastly outnumbered by the liberals and gave much less money than the liberal funders, were more strategic and arguably had a greater impact because they were more focused on, creating new ideas that could be disseminated throughout the, throughout public debates and so forth. So, you don't want to just look at money. You want to look at how it's strategically deployed, because his conclusion was that the conservatives, even though they didn't spend as much money, were more effective. And so, it's hard to get a handle on impact. But I think if you want me to talk about impact some more, I can. But I think that's
well, why don't we go to
how
what
I'm thinking about ideology versus philanthropy versus impact, or three different questions, kind of.
Yeah. Well, let's go to exemption from impact to harsh critiques, right? So this is all anti-democratic, a progressive would say, totally oversimplifying. I mean, I get it. But in this era of, I'll say, populism, call it Trumpy or post-Trump or whatever, if it's the case that most of policy-oriented big philanthropy, which I understand is the 1% of all philanthropy, is progressive,
mm-hmm.
A sort of primal scream populist objection would be, what is this? Why is that being tax incentivized? And some have proposed doing something about that. Not many, but some. I mean, is that unreasonable? I mean, they're going after, some have suggested, I'm thinking of a particular candidate who would be considered populist in Ohio, J.D. Vance.
Mm-hmm.
What's with this, let's tax the endowment of Harvard. And I think he said, let's go after foundations. I mean, right. That logically follows from the critique with which at least your observations are consistent, I'll say. I'm not signing you up for anything here, but aren't we headed for more of that kind of talk and proposals? And, might there be an alliance between some of the people who say things like that and progressives who are concerned about the anti-democratic nature of philanthropy?
Yeah, I think this is a good point. I mean, this could be one of those rare moments in politics where we do have strange bedfellows. And, I think to extend your question a little bit, when we think about kind of the divides in American politics today, and I'm a political scientist who studies American politics, I mean, we think about kind of so much more of our politics, I think now, is structured around identity claims and grievance claims on both the left and the right. And on the left, I think there's a concern that efforts to become a more inclusive, egalitarian, multiracial democracy, that those efforts have stalled, and in fact that we may be experiencing a backlash. So I think that on the right, you have a kind of a similar concern, and that's that the liberals, progressives, have kind of colonized all the big institutions of society, such that, so that would be government, that would be maybe to some extent corporate America even, but certainly, K through 12 education, certainly universities, certainly, and
Hollywood,
I think
culture.
Hollywood, yeah, exactly, and foundations as well. Now, I think we could have a debate about to what extent that's true, but I think there's more than a kernel of truth to it, honestly. And I said, this is a university professor. And, philanthropy is going to get, and already is starting to get caught up in that debate. So again, we get to this question of, well, what's the alternative? This is a question that was posed to me in one of my interviews, I should say. So it's one I had been thinking about, but it's one that I think philanthropists are also thinking about. And, should we tax foundations at a greater amount? I guess, if I were a populist and I were thinking about this, where does that money go? It goes to government, right? If we tax individuals, don't allow them to amass great fortunes, or, we require, or we do something to kind of disincentivize philanthropy, that money is going to go somewhere. So it's either going to go to buying more consumer goods, which these billionaires, they make money faster than they can buy yachts, right? So this money's going to have to go somewhere. So potentially, where's it going to go? Back in estate taxes, so back to the government. So again, you have to sort of think, what is the alternative? And I think a lot of scholars get, we have these critiques, and I think they're very valid and very important critiques. And then you get to the, well, what do we do about it section of the discussion or the book or whatever. And I think people, right and left, always land on the same proposal, which is let's, create more transparency. Some people have other proposals, but that's the one that just, everybody's like, okay, well, we just have to have some sort of informal accountability through transparency, because most people don't, I think, really want more regulation of philanthropy, and, questions, and income inequality is its own sort of big issue that there's not much political will to address at the moment. So I've been thinking about, so what do you do? And that would address the concern on the left that, you've got unaccountable billionaires and non-transparent foundations that are just driving agendas and distorting public preferences and doing things that should be done through more democratic means, through school boards or elected officials or whatnot. And concerns on the right that the major institutions in public life are really that everyday individuals feel very disconnected from these big institutions that are shaping the world around them. So you're right, it is a common, slightly different flavors, but kind of a common critique. So one thing I've been thinking about is, what if, and this is just a very inchoate idea, so if people are watching this and want to email me, please do. What if foundations, and it would have to be voluntarily kind of created a norm that every grant or every grant program would go through something that I'm going to call a civic impact review. I'm open to different kinds of terminology, but that would be kind of similar to those environmental impact statements that the government has to undergo when they're going to do construction or whatnot. See what impact it's going to have on the environment. What if we think about every grant and what impact it's going to have on core features of healthy democracy? And here we could borrow from democratic theorists. I like Robert Dahl a lot, and so what if you have a grant and you think, okay, so Dahl says there are 6 features of healthy democracy, and I'll run through them quickly just so people can have a tangible way of thinking about this proposal. So he says that elected officials that effectively represent their constituents, free, fair, and frequent elections, freedom of expression, access to alternative sources of information, associational autonomy, I think that means a vibrant civil society, and inclusive citizenship. So those 6 things, he says, are just core to healthy democracy. So what if foundations voluntarily had some sort of structured process by which they looked at every grant or every grant program and said, to what extent do these grants advance or undermine these different goals, these different metrics or these features of democracy? Now, again, I think this would have to be voluntary. I don't think there's any political will to impose this on foundations. I don't think it would be workable to do so. And I don't even think it'd be constitutional, frankly. So this would have to be something that they would be adopting in some way. And, you know, to be sure, I'm sure foundations would say, oh yeah, my grant for XYZ
Yeah.
does, you know, 3 of those 6 things.
That's
But
what
I
I was
still-
going to say. I thought
Yeah.
the brilliant program officers were doing this already. I mean, I used to
Right.
be one, but
Well,
okay.
but it would be structured, it would be specific, and it would be, the focus would not be on the typical outcome measures. So is this education grant going to improve, you know, math scores? I think that's the way foundations usually think about their work, right? I'm saying use democracy as a dependent variable, as the outcome variable. And I think even if they cheated and said, okay, well, yeah, I can check all 6 of those boxes, I think at least going through the process might be instructive, might be a good exercise in its own right. And, you know, maybe at the aggregate, maybe I'm idealistic here, might actually alleviate some of the concerns or address some of the concerns that skeptics on the left and the right have, you know, I think rightly raised. So it's an early idea, but it's something I'm thinking about for this book.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good. I was going to ask to finish. What are you working on next? But you just told us.
Well, that's just a little piece, but I'm actually working on a book about philanthropy and democracy. So, you know, teeing off, looking at the fact that Freedom House, which is the authority on these matters, ranks the U.S. as a backsliding democracy. So we are still a vibrant democracy, but not as much as we were 12 years ago. And, you know, if you look globally, the number of countries that are backsliding, that are becoming less democratic, outnumber the countries that are becoming more democratic. It didn't used to be that way. So there, you know, Freedom House is sounding alarms. I think many people, you know, including well-known conservative movement actors, have expressed concern about, you know, events of recent years. And it's not just, you know, our former president. It's a much broader set of concerns about the functioning of government and democracy. And so my question in this book is pretty simple, which is, you know, if we believe that the norms and institutions of American democracy are eroding, as I do, what are our most privileged people doing about it? That's the question. So I've been interviewing wealthy people who are donors. I've been interviewing thoughtful observers. I've been interviewing foundation presidents, and I've got a big, huge data set of grants that I'm sorting through to sort of figure out what, you know, if we are a democracy that's in some form of crisis, you know, what are these privileged institutions that have all this money and resources, and they're supposed to be, as members of civil society, you know, defending an open society? What are they doing?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us. If it's okay, I think we'll end there, unless you think there's something I didn't ask. Okay.
You asked great questions, and thanks for having me.
Well, great. I totally appreciate your doing this, and we'll get the Giving Review mug off to you as soon as we possibly can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.